Hey everyone, this is Monday morning, June 30th. This week's video on the Eagles. I'll be covering some things that I heard this morning on the radio, plus breaking down by position group and how I feel about those moving forward. I was listening to the radio this morning. I listened to Sirius XM um, network, and I was listening to the NFL channel. The NFL Network Sirius satellite channel is pretty good, especially in the mornings. They cover a lot of really good stuff. The afternoons, don't care for it as much, but that's just how it goes sometimes. But they were running down their list of the most complete teams for the 2025 season. Part of that, what I saw was, of course, their top three was the Ravens, excuse me, the Chiefs were third, Ravens were second, and they had the Eagles first, which doesn't really come as any surprise to any of us Eagles fans. We know that Howie built a great roster and that, things are going to move forward. They're going to be great, this year. But, like I said in my first video about the Eagles, I am always cautiously optimistic. And that just goes from being a lifelong Eagles fan. So part of the reason they said that was, the rate, the Chiefs, of course, coming off their Super Bowl appearance, they seem to have made some right moves here in the offseason. Same with the Ravens, as far as, as long as they had Lamar Jackson and stuff, they're always going to be, and Derrick Henry, they're always going to be super, super competitive. They also basically rebuilt their defense this past offseason. They've also added Jaire Alexander. So that's going to contribute to them having probably a pretty good year. As far as the Eagles go, their roster pretty much intact, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Plenty of experience there with Steen coming back. Um, but I am a little, like I said, I'm always a little nervous about the Eagles. But the broadcaster said the Eagles were the best team to have the best chance of repeating since the Chiefs team that beat the Eagles 2 years ago in Super Bowl 57. So I think the Eagles have a really good chance of repeating, and that goes without saying. However, for me, like I said, I'm always a little more cautious. Starting with the defensive side of the ball. Nolan Smith is still recovering from his torn triceps from the first half of the Super Bowl game. He made a comment on the um, oh, I forget what Cooper DeJean uh, the Blankenship DeJean amazing Mike's podcast, he said on Nolan Smith said on there that you could see, and they did show the highlights that his arm was dragging pretty much the whole second half of the game, and he was in and out a couple times chasing Patrick Mahomes. So that was kind of interesting. But so I am a little cautious about him coming back from that. That injury always has a tendency to be reoccurring. That's what I've learned over the years of being an NFL fan. Um, and then you have to also look at Campbell. He, number one draft pick. He's already signed. He's been there for camp. But shoulder injuries are always one of those things that makes you a little cautious as well. He is recovering from a successful surgery. Hopefully that all goes well. Um, but on the flip side, the Birds did lose five defenders, to free agency. Of those, I think Slay and Sweat will be missed the most. Slay's leadership in the secondary and just Josh Sweat's, pass rushing abilities and what we saw in the Super Bowl. But I'm not as upset about the Milton Williams as a lot of people are. I mean, he was a backup. He didn't start. He was sat behind Davis and Carter, but he did have a big Super Bowl, and that's what got everybody's attention. However, I have heard that Vrabel's had to get on him about being motivated and stuff up there in New England. That's come up in a couple things, especially early on in OTAs. Some of that could have also been fatigue, but I think that New England's paying him a lot of money. They're going to expect big, big things from him. So, I'm a little less worried about him being gone since he wasn't a starter to begin with, but I think he's got a good career ahead of him. And we all know Carter and Davis will dominate up front. I know that there was talk about whether or not the Eagles should sign the extension on Davis. I'm glad they did. I think, especially the way he showed up for OTAs. He said that, he lost a lot of weight. He, some of the reports when you watch some of the Philly news channels was he looked faster. He looked a lot quicker on defense. He looked a lot quicker on the line. So those things make, give me cause for optimism with him. And I'm glad that they did sign him, give him that 5th-year option, and give him a chance. Maybe this is his 1-year prove it deal for him. Let's see. So CJ Gardner-Johnson was a big loss in the secondary, mainly because of his interceptions. They do say he was a cap casualty hit. I don't necessarily agree with that. He was outspoken when he was here, and it's why he usually gets, was sent away the first time. That's also why he's probably being sent away this time. Just a little feud that he had with Slay. I think Makuba will be a big help once he's signed. As we know, a lot of the second-round picks have not yet signed. They're all looking for guaranteed deals, especially since the guys above them got guaranteed deals. And so I think that's what everybody's agents are holding out for. But he's the only pick that the Eagles have that isn't signed. But I think him sitting out will not work to his advantage to getting playing time. Everybody talks about how complicated Fangio's defense can be. And we know that that's kind of, his thing is, you got to be there, you got to learn, so getting him signed by training camp is, a big priority, but it's probably a good thing he went through OTAs. He's got the playbook. He can at least start reviewing some of that on his own. I think Adoree Jackson from the Giants will help out. I think he'll be some of that veteran presence that they need. And then, we know that Jean and Mitchell are outstanding. As far as linebackers, Uche is not a bad linebacker. I heard, some of his things were just injuries with the Giants. So hopefully he'll come over and be, pretty effective. Excuse me, not with the Giants. He was with the Chiefs. Sorry about that. Jackson was with the Giants. And then we know Zach Vaughn will be back. He seems pretty motivated. He talked about, on a couple of different podcasts he's been on, that he's extremely motivated to get back in and work. And I think Ajari will be a pretty good asset for the Birds. I'm a big fan of Nakobe Deans, but we always know with leg injuries, whether it's a knee, ankle, hip, with any particular player, that those are always difficult to come back from. So I do have concerns about his injury status, especially since he was only able to lightly work out during OTAs. But I'm a big fan of his, and I hope that he's able to come out and play at a high level after his injury. Offensively, I was a big Mekhi Becton fan. I think that's a big loss for the Eagles. He was a road grader. I mean, he just went in, plowed people over. He fit right in. It shows that Stoutland University works, since he was able to revive his career and get a little bit of a payday from the Chargers. But I wish the Birds could have held on to him. I understand why they didn't. They had Steen in the wings. And he's been an adequate backup, being able to play it just about everywhere across the offensive line. And they also brought back in Matt Pryor. And, so people have been worried about, oh, Johnson, he hasn't played with these guys full time, but, Lane's Lane, he's going to be able to play with anybody at any particular time. So the offensive line, is pretty subtle for a long time. I know Lane Johnson keeps saying he's ready to, he'll be retiring as an Eagle in probably 2 or 3 years. But he also said on the Greenlight podcast with Chris Long that, he feels like he's just now peaking, which is pretty scary, considering how good Lane has been, and especially how good he has been the last 4 or 5 years, and going a couple of years without ever giving up a sack. So, I think he's going to be around for a while longer. I think he's going to play at a high level. And then we know Mailata, Dickerson, Jurgens, and Johnson, are just who they are. So I don't expect a big drop off or anything under the Eagles offensive line, even though a few times when there's been pressures, I've often looked and went, oh yeah, it was Steen that was in the game. But Stoutland, this is Steen's 3rd year, so maybe he'll come around, keep coming around. I heard he did work out with during OTAs with all the first team offensive linemen. So I expect that to be, a big highlight for him. And then the rookies, I've heard Mailata speak really highly of Myles Hinton. I'm going to talk mainly about Hinton. because I'm a big fan of his dad. I was, just out of high school. I had been an offensive tackle in high school, so I had a tendency to follow tackles, like Tra Johnson and Jason Peters and Runyon and those guys with the Eagles. I was always big fans of theirs, but I was always a big Chris Hinton fan. Originally drafted by the Broncos, but then was part of the John Elway trade when Elway went to the Broncos from the Colts after he refused to play for the Colts, said he'd rather play baseball. But Chris Hinton had pretty much an all-pro career with the Colts, and Miles is his boy, and so I'm a big fan of Miles. I want him to do well. I hope he makes the Eagles. I hope he becomes that tackle that replaces Johnson, when Johnson retires. Um, so I'm biased. I'm biased there, you know. So, and I think Kenyon Green, who they got from the Texans, he's going to be a reclamation project, another Becton, another one for Stoutland to fix over time. And, we'll see what Stout's able to do with him. And because I imagine since they trade, that was all part of the CJ Gardner Johnson trade, I think part of that will bring, the Eagles will at least hold on to him for this year and see what happens. A lot of these guys did sign 1 year contracts, so they're on make it or break it deals. The receivers, solid, of course, as long as you have Devonta and AJ, the Eagles receivers are going to be pretty tight. Devonta's always going to be the number 2 to AJ, but that doesn't matter. Those guys are unselfish. They just want to win football games. The quarterback wants to win football games. That's the way Hurts is. And as a PSU fan, I'm pulling really for Johan Dotson to have a good year. I think that he can be a good number 3. Some people are worried about his production. I mean, he was learning a new offense, things like that. So guys sometimes struggle that first year. When they're learning a new offense. So I look for him to blossom a little bit. Supposedly that Eagles have some good receivers in, rookies, some free agents, but I would like to see Dotson stick around as the number 3 at least. Because I think he will get some catches this year. Tight end wise, Goddard's Goddard. Solid, great tight end when he's in there. The problem is sometimes he's made out of glass, and then to use my son's word, made out of glass. So, it's injuries that, seem to plague him and keep him from being an all-pro. But he's solid as long as he's healthy. Calcaterra, not 100% sold on him yet, but he has showed some flashes of brilliance. He's made some acrobatic catches, in the playoff. I think it was one of the Washington games. Can't remember if it was a playoff or not. Goddard fumbled and Calcaterra was right there to recover the fumble. So I think, that's going to work in his favor. And then Jalen Hurts, what can I say? Just Jalen. That's another thing on the NFL Network radio I was listening to. They say he keeps getting better and better every year. He keeps improving. His decision making is getting better. And all those things may be true, but there's been those of us who have been sold on him for 3 years, ever since he became a starter when Sirianni came in, and especially after getting the Birds to Super Bowl 57. But the GM seemed pretty sold on him, so I don't know why there's all the hype, on the talking heads on ESPN and CBS Network and those things about, we need to get rid of Hurts, the Eagles still need an upgrade at quarterback, yada, yada, yada. Guy's a Super Bowl MVP. Outplayed Patrick Mahomes in Super Bowl 57. He's outplayed him in, Super Bowl 59. He cares about winning. He had a great college career. He's accurate, 60 some odd percent pass completion. I think it's around 68, 69. So that's all going to benefit him as well. Whether or not he's, I don't really have an opinion on why he had a down year. But I think some of it was play calling last year. And also, I think some of it's the offensive scheme. He's never going to be a 4,000-yard passer. He's never going to throw for 45 touchdowns. But that's what sells tickets. That's what, gets ESPN's talking heads excited. So I think that eventually is going to be, that's just going to be Jalen. And when we look back, he'll be an Eli Manning. He's not going to have 1 billion yards. He's going to have a heck of a lot less interceptions. I could get started on whether or not he belongs in the Hall of Fame, but this is about the Eagles. but I also think that, you know, he's going to walk away, with 3 or 4 championships, or, at the very least, 3 or 4 NFC championship rings. So, we already know he's been to the Super Bowl twice. So he's done a lot already in 4 years as a starter. Eagles have won over 45 games in the last 3 years. So I don't see this team taking a nosedive, but I do see some yardage falling, record falling off this year. They got a really tough schedule, but that's another video for another day. So back to this, we're breaking down positions. Running back, you know, I'm a big fan of Shipley, so I hope he gets some carries this year. But I also look for Barkley to carry the ball less, and I think part of that is, even though he says he's not beat up and he feels like he's felt the best he's felt in years, I still think that those amount of carries and those amount of yards take their toll on a running back. I've seen it too many times over the years. Guys come back from those 2K years and just really struggle. Larry Johnson, Chris Johnson, even Barry Sanders rushed for less yards the next year. I think Eric Dickerson was the only one that's really was able to overcome that and get close again. Um, I think Peyton one year got to like 1,800 yards. So I really think that, the Eagles under Petula will be better off. Fewer carries to Barkley, more passes down the field. Maybe that'll get people off Hurts's back. Sirianni has always been known as wanting to throw. So I really think that, there will be more passing this year. Part of it, I think, to give Barkley a break, and I hope Shipley spells Barkley on some runs, as we were able to see what he did. AJ Dillon comes in. I think that he'll be an asset. He's a big power back. He could spell Barkley on occasion as well. Um, but I think the Eagles are pretty solid 1 through 3 in the backfield with those guys. Um, Rest of the quarterbacks, McKee, big fan of Tanner McKee. I really want him to do well. It may end up not being with the Eagles, though. I don't see him being a career backup, not the way he's looked in relief of Hurts, and especially after the way he looked in the Dallas game. I really think that McKee's got a bright future ahead of him, whether it's with the Eagles or not. Which, like I said, unless something happens to Hurts, I don't see it happening with the Eagles. I'm also a big DTR fan. I was a big fan of his when he was at UCLA. Kid was just a winner, knew how to come back, knew how to play well in pressure situations. Not sure. I think Cleveland kind of broke him a little bit. Um, but I could see him being a good number 3. But the Eagles weren't drafting McCord for a reason. He looked really good at Syracuse, had some big games at Syracuse. Um, Played really well, but against top like competition when he was at Syracuse. So what I kind of see is either DTR or him ending up as the number 3, and then one of them on the practice squad, probably McCord. Not a whole lot of people talked about him coming out of the draft, but I think he was a little underrated coming out of the draft. I've been wrong before about those things, but so who knows? um, but I think DTR will improve. He's a veteran. He has some playing experience, and that may be what makes him a number 3 um, off the top. So lastly, I'm going to finish up this video just talking about injuries and the unknown. Like I said, I can't 100% certainties guarantee the Birds will win 14 or 15 games, not with their schedule. Like I said, scheduling is going to be another video as we get closer to training camp. But I can see easily 12 wins, a 12-5 season. Who knows if the curse of the NFC East will rear its ugly head, since the only team to repeat as champions in the last 25 years has been the Eagles, back, under Andy Reid. So I don't, but like I said, and hopefully the injury bug won't get them and stays away. That was the big thing with the Lions, so I think the Lions would have given the Eagles a better NFC championship game than the Washington Commanders did. I knew I was going to do that. When you're old like me, some hard books die hard. So next week's video, we'll cover the schedule breakdown. Like I said, we'll go through each game, breaking them down. The last thing that I want to talk about is NBC Philly. Many of you probably follow their videos or live on the East Coast. Since I live in New Mexico, I don't get them unless I watch their YouTube videos. But they're currently copying down, talking about their top 5 Eagles to make the Pro Bowl this season who've never made it before. There's some great guys on that list. Goddard, again, stays healthy. Jordan Davis, um, Jordan Mailata. I was surprised that he didn't make the Pro Bowl. I was really surprised by that because people talk about him as one of the best tackles in the league. Um, same with Landon Dickerson. Jorgens has stepped up big time. So any of those guys could step up and make the Pro Bowl this year. They could even name all 5 Eagle starters or 4 of the 5 Eagle starters to the Pro Bowl. Hopefully they'll never get to play in it because hopefully they'll be in the Super Bowl. And the Birds Huddle podcast is counting down, their top 25 most important Eagles for 2025. Some familiar names on there, some guys that, they're looking forward to stepping up. Jordan Davis was there, Mailata's there on that list. Guys like that, just guys that they really want to stay healthy and are important for them to get through the season unscathed. So I really think that, that's something that I'll look at as my top 25 most important Eagles. Number one, of course, it's going to be Hurts. 2 is Barkley. 3 is Lane Johnson. That's just off the top of my head where I think I would go with that list. AJ Brown, Devonta Smith, keeping those guys healthy, keeping them in the mix. Um, games Eagles lost 2 years ago were games that AJ Brown wasn't on the field, so it changed the play calling, changed the dynamics. So I think there's a lot of things to really talk about before we get to training camp, and I look forward to bringing those things to you. Hope you all have a great week. Talk to you later.